Well, hello everybody. Time for another Renaissance Woodworker Live, and specifically I'm running just an open Q&A here tonight. It's been a couple of months since I've done one of these, since I was working on the Perch stool, so I figured why not? We've always got plenty of questions, more questions than I usually have time for. So that's the plan. Let me get these headphones out of my ears so I've stopped hearing my voice echoing back. As usual, I have the chat room up and running. So, and I was smart this time and piped it into my 36-inch TV over in the corner, so I actually can see it from across the room. So by all means, if you have questions, throw them into the chat. Let me know what's on your mind. As usual, if you do have a question, put it in all caps because it does make it stand out a little bit, and I won't think you're shouting at me. It just makes it easier for me to see the questions because I don't have a moderator here helping me out. So anyway, good evening, Andrew. How are you tonight? Just occurred to me I need a battery in this other light over here. There we go. So, what's been happening in my shop here? Well, last thing you guys saw me working on was this Perch stool, and I got the tenons and everything flushed up. I released a video on that. What was that, earlier this week? Was that this week? No, it was last week. Did some scraping of the seat. I think I'm going to do a little bit more. It's always a bit of a kind of a fine line here. I really like some of the faceted carved look that you get here. I did a Windsor chair one time where I actually finished it with a random orbital sander, and I got that, really, really smooth surface, and it still looks nice, but it loses something. I have a continuous arm Windsor that I built at the Woodwright School, and when I kind of put them next to one another, I like the one at the Woodwright School, the slightly faceted look. It reflects more light. It gives it a little bit more interest. It's one of the things that people will tell you about handmade furniture is those slight imperfections. The light plays differently, and it kind of draws people to want to touch the furniture, which to me is the highest form of compliment. Somebody sees a wooden piece of furniture, and the first thing they want to do is go, ooh, look how nice that feels. So I'm kind of toying with that right now, just how much more smoothing, how much more scraping do I want to do? I've got some spots in here I need to clean up, some spots right around there that I need to clean up, but for the most part, I think I'm just about ready to start applying finish. And I'm just going to use an oil-based finish, something I've got in the shop, probably a General Finishes product because I've got some of that already. I installed, I don't know, you guys can't see that, hold on. I installed the planer brackets that Andy Klein and Mark Spagnolo have out. It's actually already getting quite a bit of use. Granted, it's just another horizontal surface that I will probably gather crap on, but I've already got project parts and stuff like that for some Christmas lathe work piling up over here. I've got some other plywood that I'm using for a different project, but it's really nice to have this additional storage surface, and I still have the use of my rollers underneath it. So, hey, it's the one power tool I have in the shop. I might as well trick it out a little bit, right? And then right now I'm working on a string of molding for a mirror that I'm building for the hand tool school. So let me get rid of that little thing. I actually have stuck this molding once already and decided I wanted to tweak the profile a little bit. So I had to start over again, cut out another strip, and it came out of a board that had a pretty substantial bow. And actually, it's an 8/4 board. So what I'm using is the thickness of the board. I'm actually using that as my width. So I cut out a thin strip because the final molding is only about 1/4 inch thick. Cut it out, and when I rotate it, I've got the 1 1/4 inch width that I need because it's an 8/4 board. It's almost 2 inches wide. But as typical with a long board, you'll see that bow along the length. So when I flip it 90 degrees, now I've got this wicked side bend, which actually doesn't look so bad on this piece right now because I've already flattened one in, but it was so bad that I actually had to get out the chalk line. You can see the blue lines on here and lay in parallel lines so that I could get something straight to work with. So I just used my scrub plane to kind of quickly knock off the high spots in the two ends. And what you see left is this like wicked bow. You see the blue line and that huge curve coming over top of it. I've got to remove that, but that's something that I'm just going to end up removing with a saw. So it's just one of those little things. It's a stock saving tip. Instead of using 4/4 material that then has to be thicknessed all the way down to 1/4 inch and is likely to bow all over the place, just ripping a thinner, this is about a 1/2 inch thick strip out of an 8/4 board rotating, and I've got the dimensions I need. So that's the stuff that's happening in my shop. I really need to get my button gear on Christmas gifts, get moving on there. So anyway, that's enough of me stalling. I've got some questions in the chat room here. So have I been enjoying the mini Wood Talk vacation? You know what? Yes and no. It's nice not to have to take a large portion of my Friday to record, but I miss Matt and Mark. They're good friends. We end up texting all the time. But yeah, it's nice to have a little bit of my Friday back to get some other work done. So let's see. Andrew says, how big can a panel be before warping is an issue? Before switching to, whoops, my mouse is in the way. We're switching to frame and panel. Okay. Well, the easy answer is no matter the size of the panel, it's always going to move. There's nothing you can do to stop it moving. So you have to think in context there. Frame and panel is a way to capture a panel and allow for it to move back and forth. As it's housed in a groove, it will help to keep it relatively flat, but it's not glued in place, right? So it's allowed to float and expand and contract in those grooves. So your grooves are a little bit deeper than you need and allows that expansion and contraction. That is a good way to kind of freeze the movement, freeze the warping of a panel while still allowing it to move. And that's what we're doing all the time, right? So if you're talking about a panel for a tabletop, for instance, and maybe you've got a 36-inch wide table, it's gonna want to cup over time, but you can't like screw it down and fasten it within an inch of its life, because then it won't move and it's liable to crack on you. Or in some instances, it can actually, say if we're talking about a table, here's a table, it's a workbench, but you know, you can actually move the base out of alignment if it twists or something like that. So the answer is there really is no lower limit to where you say, okay, now I don't have to worry about this anymore. Well, I shouldn't say that. If it's 2 inches wide, it's probably not going to do that much. But if you're gluing up a panel, which means it's probably wider than 6 inches or so, you always want to keep in mind, how am I going to prevent this from cupping? So where this gets to be a real issue, I'm looking around to see if I have any examples. Where's my nail box? Here it is. Where this is a real issue is if you have no way to fasten that panel. If you put it in a frame and panel, it's riding in the groove and it's restraining it. If it's a tabletop, you're screwing it down to the base, you know, but maybe you're using like wooden buttons, or you're using Z-clips or something, or figure 8 fasteners that will allow it to expand and contract, but it keeps it kind of in the same geometric plane and resists that cupping and warping that may happen. When you're dealing with smaller projects like boxes, this little compound dovetail box I made in the hand tool school, it holds a bunch of nails. I take it in my toolbox, but this panel on the bottom is what? Well, I've got a ruler right here. It is about 4 inches wide, and it's relatively thin. There is a rabbet on the inside here, so it's housed around the inside, but there's really nothing in here. I put 2 nails in the bottom to hold it in place, just kind of not really thinking at the time. But if you look, you can see that gap there as it started to cup. There's a gap there and a gap there as it started to pull away from the base a little bit. And probably the better way to handle this would have been to house the whole thing in a groove so that kept it from sliding like that. So even this 4 inches wide, it was allowed to cup. Now, I'll tell you as well that this actually got into a mishap in my shop and ended up sitting in a puddle of water, not very long, but it was enough to introduce moisture while it was fixed in place, and that's what really caused a lot of that cupping. But this is, anytime you're dealing with a panel, you want to restrain it so that it stays flat. You may use breadboards for that. You may use battens, maybe dovetailed under the underside, or it's just screwed in place. But no matter how you fasten it, that fastening method needs to allow it to shift, to expand and contract. So the question isn't how wide a panel. What you need to do is assume that every panel is going to cup on you, and your task becomes, how do I restrain it while not restricting it? Does that make sense? It's restraining, keeping it flat, but not restricting it from moving. So that's the long-winded answer on that. Carbonite Gamarian says, on your halfback, how much does it cost? And if you sold it, how much would you sell it for? Well, I'm not going to sell my halfback saw. I don't know how much it cost. I can't remember. As a Bont saw, you can look that up on Bont's Toolworks, whatever he's offering for those things right now. But no, I'm not going to sell that saw. It's a very useful saw to have around. It hangs on the wall. If nothing else, it's pretty to look at. So. Lucky Boy 13. I'm not sure. Are you asking a question there? Triple my material cost plus healthy hourly wage for time spent. Was there a question about how much does stuff cost? Because Carbonite is looking specifically for a saw cost there. So anyway, yeah, if you're looking at cost of material, I agree with you. Triple your material cost, because more than likely you're going to end up probably spending some more. But you've got to factor in an hourly wage somewhere along the way too. So, any other questions? Carbonite, are you looking for a halfback saw? And if so, what are you thinking of using it for? And what made you think I would want to sell mine? I love that saw. If you guys aren't aware, let me pull it off the till over here. I've written blog posts on these before, but this again is a Bont's Toolworks halfback saw. I don't know if anybody else is making these right now. I know Winslow did for a while. I'm not sure if Winslow is actually even still in business at this point, or if Mike is officially retired. But it's an odd beast. It's got a little bit of the back stiffener, but it's also a 22-inch plate like a panel saw. So it kind of serves as a hybrid between the two. It certainly will have its limitations in making rougher cuts and things, if for no other reason than the fact that the saw itself is just not pitched for such work. The saw is pitched typical of a panel saw, so it's going to be a finer cut for stuff that's going to be 3/4 of an inch thickness, panel type work. But that little back stiffener can be really beneficial when you've got really precise cuts to make. But it's one of those weird things that fills such a weird niche within your sawing nest that I wouldn't even really consider owning one until you probably had your bases already well covered. This is not, you may look at this and go, okay, this would be kind of a jack of all trades kind of saw, because it's got a little bit of that stiffening and a little bit of the back free section. But it's not. It's like a joinery saw, but it's more of like a big joinery saw more than anything else. So it's really hard to describe how it fits into things, but it's definitely one of those luxury items that makes sense adding after you've got some of your basics covered. What hand screwdriver companies do you use? I have several screwdrivers from Elkhead Tools. That a couple of them were given to me as a product review years ago, and then I've gone on and bought a few more. Other than that, the screwdrivers I use are actually ones that I made myself. buy those multi-driver type kits from Rockler or Penn State Industries and turn a handle myself, and that's what I end up using. But yeah, screwdrivers are not major tools in my shop because I don't actually use all that many screws. Have I ever worked with a spring pole lathe? Yeah, Andrew. I've built 3 of them. I have one in my backyard. If you dig a little bit deeper into my channel here, you'll find a video series on a bungee lathe that I built. Hand Tool School Semester 5 was entirely dedicated to wood turning. So I built a pole lathe there based on the 18th century Hulot design, the French Hulot design. Roy Underhill's made this one particularly popular on the Woodwright Shop. He's did a popular woodworking article on it. And actually James Wright, Wood by Wright, just built that same model. I actually built 2 of those lathes. And then in semester 5, I also built a flywheel lathe, continuous spinning rather than a reciprocal spin. If I were to choose one, I mean, I've got my Barnes lathe in the background here. That was kind of a always wished I had one type thing. Definitely didn't need one, but when I got the opportunity to buy it, I jumped all over it because I worked on a lathe like that at a living history museum for years. But I really love the pole lathe. So if you're thinking of building one, I highly recommend you do it. First of all, if you have a lot of turning experience, you're going to want to check that at the door and forget everything you know about turning. It's a very different experience. If you have no turning experience, then I think you'll find that a pole lathe will actually make you a better turner, because the pole lathe has absolutely no patience for improper technique. You've got to really focus on the presentation angle, the rotation, the angle, everything, riding the bevel of your turning tool in order to get it to cut right, because you're dealing with very low RPM, but you are dealing with a huge amount of torque. Your entire body weight is your torque. So I suppose if you only weigh 40 pounds, then maybe there's not that much torque, but you still get a massive amount of torque with one of these things. It's amazing how aggressive you can get, but the minute you don't present that blade at the right angle, you'll start to get all kinds of issues and it'll jam on you and different things. So I actually found that turning on my pole lathe has improved my turning tool handling technique significantly. So highly recommend you build a pole lathe. If nothing else, it's a heck of a lot easier to build than a flywheel lathe. And flywheel lathes are really nice, but they do require a lot of adjustments and tweaking over time. Just as things move around on you, as things shift, you've got to keep things really well aligned. The pole lathe doesn't require any of that. It just needs 2 centers and a rope and some sort of spring mechanism. The centers actually don't even have to align all that much. It's nice if they do, but it's such a simple setup. It's a really cool thing to do. So if you haven't seen that bungee lathe video series, there's 2-part video that's here on my channel. Check that out. If you haven't yet seen James Wright's, Wood by Wright's spring pole lathe build, it's pretty much the same lathe that I built in the Hand Tool School Semester 5. How did you come up? Sean wants to know how I came up with the slope of my stool seat. I rode on the backs of giants, Sean. The Perch stool is not a new idea. The 10-degree angle, you're talking about the slope of the seat itself, the 10-degree angle, right? Not the legs. The 10-degree angle, if you dig, I'm not going to remember the website. There are several websites out there that talk about the ergonomics of seating. There's a great book that Curtis Buchanan had recommended to me a while ago on seating, and I think Peter Galbert references it in the Chairmaker's Handbook that he put out through Lost Art Press. But it's a book that talks about chairs and how bad they are for us. It's kind of funny because it's a negative stance on chairs, but all of the reasons that the author gives for chairs being bad, chairs, what do they say, sitting is the new smoking, right? You sit all day, you get bad posture, it's bad for us. So all of the reasons it says that chairs are bad, if you take those and flip them and say, what if I did the opposite? I would end up with a good chair. And the 10-degree angle is something that is kind of decided upon. It actually aligns your spine. So as you sit, I was talking about this in a live thing I do with Hand Tool School apprentices the other day. this chair actually promotes good posture. As I sit in it, first of all, my legs ride down and my legs are firmly planted on the floor. Second of all, my back is straight, and I've got a kind of a bad angle here, but it aligns your back perfectly straight. If I slouch a little, it actually puts weight back on the seat and it's not quite as comfortable for me. So as then I adjust my backside and feel comfortable in the seat, automatically my posture gets better. And that slouching thing, what it's doing is it's causing my legs to lift off the seat a little bit, and it's adding a little bit of tension in the backs of my legs and a little bit of tension, a little bit of pressure on the tailbone. So just aligning yourself on the seat and sitting well, and you just naturally align your posture. And that's having to do with our physical structure, our skeletal structure, and how it's put together. And most chairs, when they're flat like that, they don't force that posture. So you're allowed to kind of slouch a little bit more. And moreover, the pressure of a flat chair, here I've got one. Well, this is a round seat, but the pressure of your legs on the front of a flat seat like that, it puts pressure right on your hamstrings, which oftentimes will cause you to slouch a little bit so you can move weight back away from your hamstrings, keeping that pressure out of the way. Or you'll maybe put your feet up on a rail like that, which also tilts your sitting bones back, rounding your back over, like we're moving into, cat pose in yoga or something, which is not a good thing to be sitting that way all day. Plus you get this pressure on the arches of your feet from sitting on that rung. So then I put my feet on the ground and then I get things cutting into my hamstrings, and I'm trying to kind of fix all that. The 10-degree angle eliminates all of that. And I played around with this for a little while, trying to figure out if that angle was going to work. And I basically I did this in part one of that video. I just started throwing blocks underneath that stool and kind of fiddling with the angle. I was told that 10 degrees would work by Curtis Buchanan and Peter Galbert, but I was like, you know what? I'm going to experiment myself. And sure enough, there's this like magical moment. At one point I was at 8 degrees and I could still feel the seat hitting my hamstrings a little bit. I hit 10 degrees and it went away. I don't think I played with 9 degrees, but it just works with how our bodies are put together, the angle of our pelvic bone into our femurs, up into the spine, it perfectly aligns the spine. And what's really happening is it's keeping your hip bones kind of in line with your femur a little bit. And it's kind of this fun little magic angle that works out. And if you look into ergonomic design, you look at design principles of how chairs are designed, heights of chairs and things like that, they all tend to agree on a slightly forward angle. And the more you dig into it, 10 degrees comes up time and time again. So me coming up with it is a little pretentious. I basically just, as I said, took the work of the people who came before me and just accepted it. I didn't accept it. I played with it a little bit to come up with an angle, but it's a pretty cool thing. I spent probably 2 hours on that thing the other day as I was editing a video right here at my workbench, and it was just a wonderful 2 hours. Because like the seat that I sit in at my day job at the lumberyard is exactly the opposite of that. I mean, I walk out of there feeling like I've been in a bar fight. It's so unergonomic. Sitting in that thing is an absolute pleasure. Shane wants to know, tool chest or tool cabinet for hand tools? Where is my jointer in my cabinet? I am a tool cabinet person. I worked out of, for 7 years, if you guys don't know this already, for 7 years, I was an historical interpreter at the Stepping Stone Museum in Havre de Grace, Maryland. We had 2 tool chests there, and I worked out of those tool chests all summer long. So I have a lot of experience working with tool chests and a lot of experience working with a tool cabinet. And I just don't personally like the chest idea. At first it was, I don't like the bending over thing, and then I got used to that and that wasn't it anymore. I didn't like the having to kind of sort through a really deep drawer to find my stuff. And we organized our tool chest really well, and you could slide tills back and forth, and you got a feeling where everything was, but I still was moving a lot of stuff out of the way. The tool cabinet for me lays everything out so that it's just within reach. So for instance, I was using my chalk line and my scrub plane. I come over and, like, you know, basically almost no look to get my scrub plane. I know exactly where it is. I'm not even going to reach down, move any tills out of the way to get to my planes on the bottom. That's exactly where that belongs. My joiner, by the way, here. My joiner is in this side wing. This has all of my heavy milling planes. Joiner, foreplane, jack plane, scrub plane all live on this particular side. This other wing over here is nothing but smoothing materials. I've got a number 2, 3, and a 4 scraping plane, and 2 other number 4 planes that have been set up for specific smoothing actions. The interior side, you know, you can have a till that has your chisels in it, and I suppose you could even pull the till out and bring it over to the workbench, but I know all of my chisels are right here, and they're just immediately within reach. I can grab them, go back to work. I did a shop update video a while ago about organizing my tool cabinet and why I did it that way. And that in and of itself, watching that video ought to give you a really good idea of how I just feel like there's more options. You can have more shelves. The fact that it's up off the ground and it's right at eye level, you make some things really nice, like my molding planes up top. You know, I'm hardly old by any means, but it's a heck of a lot easier to see that little tiny letter printed on the end, that little tiny number printed on the end of the hollows and rounds when it's right here instead of down in the shadows of a tool cabinet. So some of it is a personal thing, but I can tell you that I have experience working in both methods, and I just like the ability to kind of lay things out. It would be the same way if there were no tool cabinet and I just had everything on the wall. Just instant access and being able to position things exactly where you want it. I've also got a bigger canvas to play with here. I've got my drawers and things like that that have very specific uses, but this section here is what really kind of takes the cake in the cabinet versus chest war. So, and yeah, the jointer's over on the left-hand side. I also have another jointer, a 36-inch jointer that lives on top of the cabinet underneath it. Sorry, to pull it out this side. This is a Scott Meek joiner, big old giant thing that I use for large projects. Built a bed a little while ago, really wanted a nice flat rail. It's a 65-inch rail. Using a 36-inch long joiner plane definitely made a bigger difference. But yeah, I built my tool cabinet and specifically downsized my tool set so that it would fit my cabinet, and I haven't really needed to add too much, but I have added a few other planes and other things since then, which is why I have this little shelf that I built just hanging on the wall underneath it just for overflow, chair making tools and some panel raising planes and toothing planes and things like that that are specific use enough tools that they don't really live in the cabinet and get accessed all the time. Brian, where did Tom's Tips logo or jingle come from? Greg Humphrey wants to know, socket chisel preferred? I guess that's a question. When it comes to bench chisels and paring chisels for that matter, well, mostly bench chisels, I do prefer socket chisels. I like the fact that they're easier to work with as I'm pounding on them. They're getting tighter, but I also can swap out the handles if need be. Let's see if I can do this right now. Yep. Whack the handle on the bench and it will come loose. And I've turned a longer handle that pops in. And now I've got a lot of leverage and flexibility with a long handled paring chisel. I just like that ease of transformation. Whack the handle, it pops out. Give it another whack and I'm back to work. I don't know, I really like that flexibility. And granted, I don't do it all that much, but it's nice to know that it's there. Socket chisels can be a little troublesome like this time of year when you first start turning the heat on and things start to get really, really dry. There's a technique that Christopher Schwartz talked about years ago, just using like cheap aerosol hairspray and spray it onto the wooden part of the handle, whack it in place and it sticks, and I haven't really had any problems since then. So, but when it comes to mortise chisels, I actually don't like the socket design there. And that seems a little counterintuitive because the socket, the more you pound on it, right, the tighter the handle gets. There's no internal tang that could possibly split the handle. I like the tang. What it really comes down to is I prefer the English style pig sticker mortise chisel over, actually, I think Lee Nielsen may be the only one making socket, at least new. There are certainly vintage socket handles, but you end up with a round handle. I suppose you could do an offset turning there, but I just prefer this style of mortise chisel with a very definite orientation when you hold the handle, and the trapezoidal blade shape really makes a big difference when you're getting deep into mortises. I don't particularly like the way Lee Nielsen has made their sides parallel on their chisels. So it's not even so much the socket nature, it's some of the other geometry things of that chisel that makes me like the integral tang. When it comes to paring chisels, you really could go either way. The only issue with a socket chisel on a paring chisel, and I'm talking like the purest paring chisels, these guys, very thin blades. I mean, technically putting that long handle on my Lee Nielsen chisel becomes a paring chisel. Really anything could be a paring chisel if you're pairing with it. But when we get into these really delicate long bladed guys, the swelling that has to happen around the socket and the massive steel to support that socket, it changes everything. It changes the whole nature of the paring chisel. So I've got to go to a tang like this one. These guys are absolute joy to use. This is actually an old Ward British-made chisel. I used to know more of its provenance. I got it at Hyperkitten Tools from Josh Clark, and I've got 3 or 4 of them. Absolutely love working with them. This blue spruce is a 1.5 inch chisel, and again, it is also a tang, but I really only use this for paring. And it makes a lot more sense. Even when you get into the really big guys, like this mother of all paring chisels, I love this thing. Fantastic when you're doing, like if you need to true up tin and cheeks, if you're building big timber type stuff like this. This is not quite a slick, but it's like the little brother of a slick. Going in and surfacing long areas. When I was working on this cabinet, I've got an inside corner here where this little bump out meets this face, and I needed to pare this edge. Being able to use this long reference surface off of this face that I planed flat and coming in and paring my way right into that inside corner, big chisel like this was fantastic for that. But again, even though this chisel is already massive, adding a socket would do away with this really thin profile that we get. We'd have to have a lot more swelling and a thicker cross section, and it would pull the handle out of alignment because you've got to have that swelling there to allow for the socket to go into. Hold on, I've got a vintage chisel that one of these days I'm going to get around to. This is one that I want to turn a handle for. I've got to do some cleaning and everything, but here I've got the socket, but you can see just how much more massive in cross section the blade is as compared to this guy. Now granted, there's a little bit wider bevel on here, so it does make it look a little bit thinner, but if you really look on edge, this steel is almost half as thick as this one because of just the extra, stuff that's needed around the socket. But still, I'm gonna have fun with this. I've got a piece of curly maple over there that I think will make a really cool handle. I wanna make a really, really long one and turn it into kind of a bite-sized slick someday. I've got a lot of little projects like that that have absolutely no priority whatsoever in my shop, and one of these days I'll get around to doing them. Okay. Andrew says, how was your time at the Living History Museum? Sounds like fun. It was an absolute blast. Truly, just an incredible experience. I'm technically still on staff there. See, still have a name tag and everything. I just don't get there as much. The problem was, anytime you do volunteer work like that, it's kind of an old story, but anytime you do volunteer work, it tends to get out of control quickly. And when I joined the staff, it was myself and 2 other guys working in the wood shop, and it really fell on the 3 of us to run the entire wood shop. And it was open every single weekend all summer long. And occasionally we would have to come in during the week and do school tours when we could make it work. Well, there was no one else. Like, you never could take any time off. And if I went on vacation, and I went up to Maine to my in-laws, I had to like move mountains to be able to make things work. Or I ended up leaving one of my colleagues in a lurch because they were left in the shop all by themselves. Well, those other 2 guys, when I started, they were in their 70s. They're both in their mid 80s now, I want to say. One of them's even older, probably, John's probably 89 now at this point. So they were both slowing down, and one of the guys ended up just not being able to do it anymore due to just failing health. And to be honest, it is hot. Middle of summer, Havre de Grace, Maryland, right on the Chesapeake Bay, 98% humidity and 95 degrees on a nice day, and absolutely no ventilation in the shop. We have the whole back wall. Somebody in their infinite wisdom took out some windows and put in a cinder block all the way up to the top of those little like cellar windows. So there's no air moving through it at all. And it's like a good 10 degrees warmer back in the shop than it is like in the front area where the visitors walk through, because at least there's some breeze in there. So it can be very, very taxing. So what ended up happening is suddenly I was the only guy, and I was obligated to be there. So I'm working all week and then spending all weekend up at the Living History Museum, which, don't get me wrong, could be a lot of fun, but I also had no shop time for myself. I had a business that I was trying to run in the hand tool school. So something had to give. We were able to find some more volunteers that kind of opened things up a little bit. And then honestly, I just needed some time away. I just had gotten burnt out doing it every single weekend. Now, that's the negative side of things. The good side was, the best part was the kids. And I've talked about this on Wood Talk a couple of times, but we would get these kids who would come in who had no exposure whatsoever, not just to hand tools, but no exposure to making things with their own 2 hands. And you could just see them light up, and they would be so excited. And I remember I had a kid, I'm sure I've told this story before, I had a kid that came in who you could tell was ADHD or something like that. He was all over the place, just crazy, like a little Tasmanian devil came in. And I was using an egg beater drill with this little, probably 6-year-old girl, showing how to drill a hole with an egg beater drill. And we were very, parents were always there, and it was always, is it okay if, it's not like we handed them a chisel or anything like that, but you would always say to the parent, is it okay if I show her how to do this? And of course the parent was cool with it. And this kid was immediately, like, he went from a blur to this like stationary, just fascinated watching the egg beater drill. And you could see he suddenly went from like crazy, like out of control to shy. And he's like, can I try it? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And he took it. Next thing I know, he drilled like 20 holes in this piece of scrap cedar and was just loving life. So I saw his dad, and his dad was ear to ear grinning. And I said, come over here over to the shaving horse. And he pulled out a draw knife, and we shaved down a piece of beech. I don't know, it was a log about 2 inches, 3 inches in diameter, a little stick. And we shaved it down, and I got a flat face. And the cool thing about a draw knife is if you hang on to it, if you keep both hands on it, it's really difficult to hurt yourself. And you may think there's this razor sharp blade here. This is not a tool I want to hand a kid. And again, there's a parent right there. I'm generally like sitting behind them on the shaving horse. He's right in here, and you're kind of guiding his hands. But if you keep both hands on, it's really hard to hurt yourself. Like, you can't, unless you're double jointed or something, even then, it's really hard to hurt yourself. So I worked with him with a draw knife, and he ended up shaping it and just loved it and was creating these shavings. Next thing you know, we made this like wooden katana, like samurai blade. I think you call that a bokken, practice sword. Typical 10-year-old boy into ninjas. he made this sword and just loved it. And afterwards, his father came up to me and said he was severely, not severely is not the right word, that's such a negative connotation. He was autistic, was on the spectrum for autism, had ADHD as well, and was kind of borderline Asperger's. And he said, I've never seen him so focused in all my life. That summer, this would have been in June, that summer he came back once a month, all the way through October. And we spent, I don't know, a couple hours. Because there'd be days when it was really, really slow and you didn't really have to do any presentations or anything. And I practically took this kid in as an apprentice, and it was a wonderful experience. And then, you know, you get your blowhards that come in, the guys that think they know everything about hand tools. Some of them actually do, don't get me wrong. A couple of these guys come in that have 30 years on me and have been working with hand tools longer than I've been alive, but you learn great things from them. But then you get the other guys who are like, you know, I can't tell you the number of times I heard, oh, you could do that faster with a powered router. I'm like, okay, whatever. So it was fun. I can tell you, going to places like Colonial Williamsburg now, I have much greater respect for what those guys do. Being able to actually work and present at the same time and actually get anything done. Because we had to build stuff. We had to build fences and we built a cider press screw one time. I was just talking about this. All kinds of things that had to be done for the museum, and they had to get done, but yet we had visitors and things. So balancing that was really kind of interesting. And I think that probably helped my presentation style, like what we're doing here, just being able to actually do stuff, although I'm not doing anything right now. But yeah, it was a great deal of fun. I hope to be able to get back into it. My fear is if I do it, then I'm going to get sucked back in, and you know, the volunteer work suddenly becomes a job, and that's just no fun. So yeah, I don't want to do that. Greg wants to know where to find Lie-Nielsen quality chisels larger than 1 inch. Blue Spruce makes Lie-Nielsen quality chisels, but I believe they cap out at 1.5 inches. This guy, which, I mean, I guess it depends upon what you're trying to do with it. This is probably the largest bench chisel that Blue Spruce makes. Depending on what you want to do, this may be just fine. This thing is probably one of the most used chisels in my shop, because of how much I love paring chisels. But you'll find as well that you can find a lot of firmer chisels. This is also 1.5 inches. This is a great chisel. There's actually a blog post way back on my Renaissance Woodworker site about this being my favorite chisel. And it's still, this is the one that I take with me when I go up to Maine. This is the one that I built pretty much almost the entire orientation semester in the school using this chisel. Firmer chisels can be found in pretty wide widths all over the place. You know, certainly your typical vintage sources, you can go to eBay and find a bunch of stuff there. But when you're talking about Lie-Nielsen quality chisels, no. You're going to find vintage ones that you're going to have to put some work into, like that socket chisel one that I just pulled out. That's going to take a lot of work. Now, does the back have to be completely dead flat all the way along its length? Probably not. But to get it brand new, you could start looking into timber framing companies like Bar Tools. But most of that stuff is going to be right into the slick model, where you're talking a 3-inch wide chisel that's like this long. So again, you have to ask yourself what you really plan to do with it. 1.5 inches will take you a very long way. That 2-inch wide, big, you know, Excalibur paring chisel I have is a great thing to have. But again, kind of like the Halfback Saw, I wouldn't worry about getting one until I had a bunch of other stuff fleshed out in my toolkit. So I think probably you're going to have to go to Blue Spruce for that, unless there's another boutique maker that I'm not aware of yet. But honestly, I love my Lie-Nielsen chisels, but I think if I were to do it again, knowing what I know now, I would probably go all vintage. There's something very special about vintage steel that I really like. Certainly, the Lie-Nielsen chisels are more durable. Their edge lasts a little bit longer. But I don't mind that. I don't mind sharpening. I've got a leather strop that lives on my bench all the time. I'm constantly rehoning to the point where my blades never really get dull. So the durability thing doesn't really make much of a difference to me. So I would strongly urge you, it's going to require some sweat equity on your part, but look in the vintage market. You're going to find all kinds of cool stuff out there. Have I used a Hovarter vise? Oh wait, sorry. What are firmer chisels and what are their use? Firmer chisels, in its basic sense, here is a bevel edge chisel. See, it has bevels on the edge. The firmer chisel is flat on the sides. As far as their actual use, the firmer chisel is an older chisel. The labor required to grind the bevels on the side was just not necessary, or it was completely cost prohibitive back in the 17th, 18th century. So every chisel was a firmer chisel. It came with those flat sides. As far as the origin of that, I think it comes from fermoir, which is to clasp in French. Any French-speaking people in here? Fermoir? I don't know. That doesn't really matter as far as function, but they've been around a lot longer than the what I would call a bench chisel or bevel edge chisel. The bevels on the side allow you to get into some tighter spaces, but there's a lot of work. If you ever go to a factory, if you can get up to Maine and go to the Lie-Nielsen factory and watch the amount of work that goes into these chisels, first of all, you never question their price after you see all that work. But I mean, without modern day grinders and things, this would be ridiculously difficult without pulling the temper out of the steel. So everything was just left square sided. As far as their actual use, I don't know that I really have an answer to that. I don't really have an issue. I like using firmer chisels because you can find them on vintage sites really, really easily. I've never really run into a situation where that lack of an angle caused a clearance issue that was a major, major problem. Where this really comes into play is when you're working on dovetails and you're trying to pair in that inside corner. But, you know, and that's where a bench chisel can be, or a bevel edge chisel can be really beneficial. So for me, if someone knows a specific use, I can't really think. It's not like the square sides allow you to keep a mortise square or anything like that. I suppose maybe, but it just comes down to a manufacturing and what was actually possible, what was cost prohibitive. So firmer chisels, I don't think there's really anybody making modern day firmer chisels today. They do provide a thicker cross section, so it is going to be sturdier. So if you were going to be pounding on it, you're going to find that it's going to stand up to a beating a lot more. But I question how much of a beating you really need to give your chisels. If you're walloping on them too much, you're probably doing something wrong. Like it's not sharp enough, or if you're trying to take too big of a bite or something like that. So that's a half-cocked answer, if you will, to what the firmer chisel is. Stephen, I have not used a Hovarter vise. I know several people who have bought them. Anybody doesn't know, Hovarter makes a quick release vise that would be, it's pretty cool engineering. It's basically quick release in and out. So your typical quick release where you turn the handle a little and you can pull it out, but then you crank it back in. Hovarter, it's almost like it's on a piston where you can pull out the leg vise and then push it back in until it hits, and then you can adjust it from there. It's a neat setup. As far as how it compares to Benchcrafted, without any firsthand experience, I can't honestly say that, but I can tell you that the engineering on them and the quality and the people I know who have them, it's probably comparable. In some ways, it may be a bit of an apples and oranges thing just because it's a very different mechanism. I don't know. It's just one style, if I remember correctly. You could be purposed for a leg vise, or you could put it under the bench for like a wagon vise or a tail vise. I think probably the leg vise is what makes the most sense because I think it's got a longer travel than you could get with a Benchcrafted. But again, I'm not certain there. They're both going to be really, really high quality, and the 3 people I know have them on their benches certainly love them, but I don't think they have experience with Benchcrafted either to be able to say this or the other. Both are expensive, put it that way. And I think you are, in that case, getting what you're paying for because these are small boutique companies, and you know there's not going to be a huge amount of overhead built into that stuff. So maybe that's naive in saying that, but. Al, getting kids involved and passing on the skills of woodworking means our future is good. You know, and I have to underscore that point because there were several moments when I would walk in on a Saturday morning feeling very down about humanity and wishing for a meteor strike and leaving just thinking there's hope for us all. Really just seeing how some of these kids were just so excited by just silly little things. We had a spill plane off to the side. If you don't know what spills are really an 18th century method of transporting fire from the fireplace to something like a candle. Or I wouldn't want to stick the candle on the fireplace because it would melt the candle, especially an 18th century candle. You have a tightly coiled bit of wood, a shaving, it's called a spill. You light that, and because it's tightly coiled, it burns a little bit slower. Use that to light your candle, and then you use the rest of the house. There was a plane that made those spills, and in 18th century homes, you would find like a small wooden box that had a bunch of spills in it right next to the fireplace. You grabbed a spill, lit something, and you go and light your candle or whatever. We had a spill plane, and we did the whole spiel, basically what I just said about spills, and we would make them. And they come shooting out the side of the plane, all tightly curled up, and you would actually get like cheers. You do this, and people are like, woohoo! People will start clapping. It's like, to those of us that work with hand tools, we play with our shavings a fair amount, but you take it for granted, and they've never seen this before, and they were so excited about it, and you'd hand them the spill and say, here, take it, it's yours. And they're like, you're giving it to me? And you'd see these kids like walking out of the museum, like practically cradling this little shaving of wood to their chest. But everybody remembered that, and they would come back time and again. And it was one of those very kind of uplifting moments, and just seeing that, we're not entirely lost. You see the kid whose head is buried in his phone, and he puts it down just for 15 minutes to learn about a saw. That was pretty cool. Good stuff there. Anyway, how long did it take me to build my spring pole lathe? First one I built using nothing but 2x construction material from Home Depot. Built it in a weekend. That's as accurate as I can get. It's about a weekend to build it. Second one I built out of nicer quality material, so that I had to do all the dimensioning and things like that. I built it over the course of probably 2 months, but I was also filming the whole thing, so it's not a big deal. You're talking about 2 uprights, 2 horizontal pieces for the ways. The design that I did used 2 stretchers underneath. The Ulo design uses only a single stretcher. 2 feet skids, so you're 8, 6, 10, about 12 mortise and tenons. A little bit of shaping work on the uprights. The pole itself, I actually got some air-dried hickory, shaped it with a draw knife, and actually built this rounding plane, which has a 1-inch output diameter on it. And I just went back, some would call this a fork staff plane. I just once I had shaped it, I went and I rounded it. Really probably wasn't necessary, but it made it look cool. So I ended up making 2 poles for that. And I employed a modern dead center. I went to a turning supply shop and just bought a Morse tapered dead center. But really is not a difficult thing to build. Contrast that against my flywheel lathe that probably took 10 times the amount of time to build it and the amount of time to planning and all that stuff. There's just a lot more literally moving parts in a flywheel lathe. Plus you got to build the flywheel and all the other fun stuff that goes with it. So it's a super quick project. Richard McGuire, you guys know, the English woodworker, came up with a spring pole design that mounts on his bench and just uses like a board that he had stuck up in the rafters. And it was something that I think, if I remember correctly, he secured it in his leg vise. And the ways run along the bench top, and it secures everything with wedges. So it's kind of like, the milkman's workbench style of spring pole lathe. They're super simple to build, don't really require a whole lot of precision, and just a lot of fun to work with. What's on your Christmas list? What's on my Christmas list? I don't know. I stopped asking for stuff a while ago. I want to do stuff. What's on my Christmas list? I want to go to Ireland. Could somebody send me to Ireland? I want to go back to the country that I was named for. My parents went to Ireland, and then I was born about a year later, and they named me Shannon after Shannon, Ireland. So that's where I want to go. That's what I want for Christmas. What would you use a Lie-Nielsen Skew Block plane for? I don't own one, and the reason for that is I don't have a good answer to that. The Skew Block plane, what is that? The Stanley 169, 129, 131? I don't know. But there is a dovetail trick, if you will, where you put a tiny little rabbet on the end of your dovetail boards. Do I have a dovetail? easier said than done. So you'll take, here, you take your dovetail board and you put a little rabbet right in here. So you've got a ridge here that when you bring that ridge to bear on your pin board, it actually locks into place. That trick, if you will, used to be called, and again, I don't know the number offhand, I apologize. Any of you guys who know me know that I'm terrible at remembering Stanley numbers. But let's just say that skew rabbet plane was called the Stanley 169. That rabbet trip was called the 169 trick for a while, because that's solely what that plane was used for. The skew allows it to cut across the grain somewhat cleanly. The fence of that thing allowed it to ride up against the end of your already shot dovetail board, and you could precisely locate that little rabbet. So the answer is it's used for rabbets in some respect, but mostly I would technically call them cross-grain rabbets, which in British parlance would call that a philister. Beyond that, I mean, you can take the fence off and you can use it as just a regular skewed block plane. If I remember correctly, the Lie-Nielsen, they have the side part that actually comes off or attaches back on. So you can go from the exposed edge rabbet plane like this, flip the side back on, and now you've got that. So that adds a little functionality to it. The skewed nature of it just makes it work cleanly across the grain, so you can use it really for cleaning up tenon cheeks. You cut a tenon, you want to come in and flatten out the tenon cheek. It can be useful for that. I think the fence tends to get taken off and used without the fence more often than not. The thing is, though, I've actually found over the years that I prefer using one of these guys, just a wooden skew rabbet plane. You see there's a skew on the bottom. This actually works better because of the higher profile of it. I find that I can keep it vertical a lot easier. There's just a higher center of gravity and it works better, faster. I don't need a depth stop. I don't need a fence. I use a knife line and I drop the skew into that knife line and I set it from there. It's just a lot faster, I found, but that's also a personal feeling of mine. I mean, I've got multiple of these. I got a big 2.5 inch wide one that I use for tenon true up, all kinds of fun stuff. Breadboard ends, that thing's really good for that. But technically that skew rabbet plane was used for that little dovetail trick for years and years and years. And yes, 140, thank you, Jose. The 140 trick is what they call that. The Stanley 140 plane is what that skew rabbet plane that Lie-Nielsen now sells is modeled after. I know people who have it and absolutely love it. And it's one of those things where you get to woodworking as long as I have, and you end up with a lot of different tools. I tend to fall back on these guys because I've had good success with them. If I don't have those things, you tend to make do with the tools that you have. So if what you have is that Lie-Nielsen skew rabbet plane, you may find that you're using it for all kinds of stuff, because maybe you don't have a router plane and you need something that a router plane would be really good at. So that skew rabbet plane kicks in. So you'll find people that have them just rave about them. I have an apprentice who has one who just thinks it's the best thing that he ever bought. And you know, I'll ask him, well, what are you using it for? And I used it for this, and I used it for this, and I used it for this. And you know, I'm thinking, well, I would use a router plane for that. I would use one of these rabbet planes for that. I would use my regular old block plane for that. Well, I have those tools, so I have that flexibility to reach for another tool. So you'll find that sometimes having that single tool suddenly becomes a heck of a lot more valuable. Thank you, Jose. I'm terrible at remembering those numbers. I need to scroll up in the chat room here a little bit. I'm planning to set up a knockdown wood tool setup in my apartment, shared with girlfriend. Do you have advice on workbench and dust collection? I'm thinking Moravian or Keter for the workbench. The easy answer there, build a workbench as big as your space will allow. The knockdown side of things is pretty easy with any bench design. I mean, a Rubo can be made to be knocked down. The top of this Rubo is so dang heavy that there's no reason for me to actually, I have draw boarded into the tenons on the legs. I don't even need to do that. This top is ridiculous. It sits down on it. It would be so heavy. Perfect example, Where the camera is sitting right now is on my joinery bench. The joinery bench is not glued to its tenons. So the whole bench top itself just rests here. This whole bench top just rests down on top of stretchers on this leg assembly. This is not glued in place. I can lift it up a little bit. So there's absolutely no reason to do that. And it's perfectly firm and doesn't move any of that stuff. So this entire thing is knocked down. I've actually coined this the apartment workbench before, because you can put a planing beam on the side and do all kinds of fun stuff with it. But if you have the space to make something longer, by all means, go for it. I'm working with one of my apprentices right now who has a very specific space that he wants to put his bench. And he's trying to figure out where to put it. And by shifting a couple things around, we suddenly realized we can put a 6-foot bench in there. So rather than building a 4-foot bench is what he was originally thinking, he's going to put a 6-footer in there. But it is entirely knocked down so that if necessary, he can move it. It's a lot easier to move. This does not knock down. It's not easy to move, I'll tell you that. That's the first thing. Build it as big as your space will allow. And if necessary, think about what can I move in the space to give me more room. Now, how big does your space allow? If you have 6-foot space, you don't necessarily want to wedge a 6-foot bench in there. You need to have some room off the end of the bench. Preferably, I would say 2 feet on either side of the bench. The reason for that is if I'm planing and I put, my planing stop on my workbench, and if I'm going to come in and plane this board, say the wall is right here. Well, bam, my plane just ran into the wall and I can't plane my entire board. So, okay, well that means I need to move my planing stop further down so that now the blade has left the board and I haven't run into the wall. But now I've got this foot of bench space out here that basically is going unused. What you want is that little bit of elbow room on the other side. Likewise, if I'm standing here and I'm sawing something in my leg vise and I've got a wall right here, I can't saw very well. I need that overflow space to work into. At the same time, on the other side of the bench, if I've got a board that's running the full length of the bench, I can't be backed right up against a wall and trying to plane a board down here. I need some space to work into. You need a little bit of elbow room around it. So factor 2 feet, ideally, on either end of the bench. So 4 feet, if you have a 10-foot space, subtract 4 from it and you can put a 6-foot bench in there. You can put a bench up against the wall. I prefer to have full access to all sides of my bench, but I also have a dedicated hand tool workshop here where everything lives around this workbench. I'm moving around it all the time, but let's be real, most of my work is happening right here. That's why my tool cabinet's right here. That's why it's positioned where it is, where all I have to do is turn and my hands are on my tools. So if I were up against a wall, it wouldn't be the end of the world. So don't be afraid about pushing up a wall. If you have to push it against a wall, it'd be great if there are a window there so you can get some natural light there. As far as lighting goes, you want to rig up some sort of task lighting. I'm nothing but task lighting in the shop right now with these track lights that I can move around and position and do whatever, or if I'm feeling playful, I can change the colors of and make them pulse because they're smart bulbs. That's the other thing. If necessary, you can just get a couple of gooseneck lamps and put them actually on your bench, or you can actually mount them to your bench. They also make some of them that actually go in dog holes. You can just drill a hole and mount it right there, and that's a great place to go. As far as tooling, go slow, man. Think of your tools in context of the projects that you want to build. And I would actually say, pick the project that you want to build, and it may be that workbench is what you're going to start with, and think of the tools you're going to need for that workbench and acquire only those. Then, pick another project and figure out what can I do with what I already have. You can take a jack plane and, a hardware store saw a very long way. Throw in a couple of chisels, cordless drill or a brace and bit or something, you can go a really, really long way on there. So we all do it. We all have tool acquisition disorder. We fall into that trap. We start buying a bunch of tools. I did it. I ended up selling off probably more than 3/4 of them. I'm not talking power tools here. I'm talking just once I ditched power tools and I went all hand tools, I acquired a bunch of tools and I've gotten rid of at least 75% of them, sold them off, and really kind of optimized my toolkit the way it is now. It may look like there's a lot of tools here, but there used to be a lot more. But what you'll find is, as you start acquiring a bunch of tools kind of willy-nilly, you're not thinking about their utility and how often am I using them and how important are they, how specialized are they. Tools like, this is a panel raising plane. It's a full-size panel raising plane. This is a great tool if you do a lot of raised panel joinery or a lot of raised panel work. If you don't, this thing is useless. And you can raise a panel using a smoothing plane, using a chisel, for God's sake. This makes it a heck of a lot easier, but it really is not necessary until you get into a lot of that work. If you're doing a lot of cabinetry, a lot of doors, that thing's gonna be a lifesaver. But buying that until you've done a bunch, I mean, if you've never done a raised panel door before, that will make it a lot easier, but I don't know that it's necessarily to buy that. Hollows and round planes. You know, are you sticking your own moldings? Or are you just going to use, you know, an ovalo plane or something like that? In which case, you know, a dedicated complex molding plane might be better than a whole bunch of hollows and rounds. So these are the little lessons you learn as you're choosing your projects, as you're building your projects and finding those utilities, finding that 140 skew rabbet plane and going, wow, I can use this for everything. I don't need a router plane or a tongue and groove plane. If you say you don't need a router plane, then you're wrong. I'm just going to tell you that right now. You need a router plane. It's a great plane. So, dust collection. Just get a shop vac. I don't really see the need to have a full-blown dust collector. I had a 1.5 horse for years when I was running power tools. It's hard to see right now because it's way back in the corner, but you guys may remember in a shop update I did, I switched back to the Rockler Dust Right, which is like a 3/4 horse, tiny capacity. I don't produce a lot of, and really it's there because I have a power planer. That's the whole reason it's there. It functions as my shop vac at the same time because I've got one of those extensible hoses that reaches everywhere in my shop. But for the most part, I'm sweeping up my dust. I'm creating shavings. So my dust collection hangs on the wall over here. It's this little broom and this dustpan. That's not true. My dust collection is actually an air cleaner, an air filter that's hung on the wall. Because while the shavings and stuff, I sweep those up, what's really important is, sorry, turn that off. Come on. This guy up here, this jet air cleaner, is so important because there's always going to be airborne dust in the shop, in the room. And being able to clear that out quickly is the best thing that I can do. Hand sawing is going to produce dust. If you've ever sawn a highly resinous wood like Western red cedar or Alaskan yellow cedar, or even just pine from the big box store, you'll notice you get a little stuffy because, you know, you're sawing and as your hand comes up, it's dumping the sawdust like right here. As you breathe in, the smaller particles are going to get in there and it's just not, it'll mess you up over time. So having that air cleaner was probably the best thing. Being able to sweep up my shavings, flip on that air cleaner, let it run for 15, 20 minutes in a shop my size. The air is super clean at that point. From a respiratory issue, I don't really have to worry about it. Or buy a respirator, man, and put that on. But as far as the actual collection, a shop vac is really, is a great solution. It will actually suck up those shavings too. Just make sure it's one that takes bags, because if you don't have a bag in there, it's going to mess up that filter really fast and clog it up super, super fast. So I think I've got time for one more question. Wow. Empire or Rebel Alliance? Rebel Alliance, Dwayne, come on. Yeah, I love this shirt. If space is not an issue, how big would you build one? I assume you're talking about a workbench, Anthony. 10 feet, 12 feet, 10 feet, 10 feet. Why? Because most of the moldings that I end up sticking are 8-foot boards. Let me rephrase that. Most of the moldings that I end up using to wrap around a cabinet, I end up needing around 84 to 96 inches. And again, if you're hand sticking moldings, you want to stick the entire run. So the front and the sides all come out of the same board. That way you get a good consistent profile. If you stick each profile individually, there's always a chance there's going to be slight variations that are going to require some fine tuning to get the profiles to match up. So I'm sticking the entire length. More often than not, I'm using an 8-foot board for that. I have an 8-foot bench. This is actually a little shy of 7 feet right now. But when I've got an 8-foot molding, even with my sticking board in place, I'm right off the edge of the bench. And 9 times out of 10, I'm kind of pressing my luck a little bit. What I'd like to have is, if I need 8 feet of molding, I'd like to have a 9-foot run of molding stuck, because you're going to lose stuff as you miter it, and there's always errors that happen that you need to recut a miter. So I generally like to have a lot of extra, at least a foot extra. So I could find myself using 10-foot, 11-foot boards and sticking around a molding that way, which would be really difficult on an 8-foot bench. I could build a longer sticking board, but then I'm going to need some additional support and stuff like that. Beyond 10 feet, I just couldn't, I can't see myself needing that. It would just end up with wasted space, and that would be an extra 2 feet that I could put something else like a lathe or a joinery bench like I have now. I mean, I've got probably 6 feet from the end of the bench to the wall, so I could add more bench here. Technically I could add 4 more feet of bench, right? But I have the flexibility because of the shorter bench to put a joinery bench against that wall, which I use that thing all the time. So there is that fine line to walk of, how big am I going to need? If I'm building big stuff like boats, and if I were building beds all the time, or, much, much larger pieces, a longer bench, like a 12-foot bench, might be beneficial. If you look at you go to the Boeing Museum up in Washington, you'll see these like 15, 20-foot long benches because they were assembling wings on the bench and they needed support for it. So for your average shop, an 8-foot bench is really, really nice, but you'll find enough reasons why you want to go to a 10-foot bench that if space were not an issue, I would make it 2 feet longer. Can do, my perch is over in the corner. No, it's not finished yet. I talked about that at the beginning here. I will probably be applying finish hopefully in the next week or so, as soon as I get some time to do it. Router planes do rock. I thought I saw one more question in here. Where was that? Oh, it's because I have to scroll up in the chat room. Yeah, there it was. Do I have any good budget clamp recommendations? Yeah. I'm a big fan of parallel clamps, and those are not budget clamps at all. But those are definitely something worth graduating into. I do think that a good F-style clamp will take you a long way. And again, a lot of the clamps that you need are going to be based upon the type of work that you're doing. So I am actually not one of those guys that says you can never have too many clamps. I'm actually pretty conservative in my clamps. You can see I've mostly gravitated towards the jet parallel clamps, but these are Rockler F-style clamps. And I've had them for so long, I can't tell you what they cost, but I know they go on sale a lot. They're not a whole lot. These things are really, really great. But at the same time, from a budget perspective, I love these guys. These quick clamps, pick them up at Home Depot. You can get them on sale sometimes for like ridiculously cheap. These things offer plenty of clamping pressure when you're dealing with smaller parts. These are, 12 inches? I've got some 24 inches over on the other side of the shop. And I use these all the time for gluing together furniture parts, but also smaller like boxes and things like that. They're incredibly beneficial. Also great for having around the shop for securing work or holding things in place, clamping things down on my post drill table, or an additional clamp on my workbench or something. And These are like the light duty, the really super cheapo ones. They actually make even heavier duty ones that actually get even a little bit longer. And I think a lot of people are worried they don't offer the amount of clamping pressure that you need. The fact of the matter is that good joinery doesn't require immense amounts of clamping pressure. When it comes to gluing up panels and working to keep them flat, though, it is really difficult to beat a good parallel clamp. And there are certainly, who is it? Paul Sellers has the video on taking Harbor Freight clamps and making them better. I know a lot of people have done that. If you haven't seen that, that's worth checking out. But I got to tell you, since I built these guys, that video I did on panel clamps, I love using these for gluing up multi-board panels. It holds them super flat. I end up with a really, really great clamping bond. And you know, I showed you how to build this for like $17 worth of wood and hardware. The fact is I'm not a big clamp guy. I've run into so many situations where I'm never in a, let me rephrase that. I'm never in a situation where I'm building so much stuff that I can't afford to wait 30 minutes, 45 minutes for glue up to finish to use those same clamps somewhere else. I suppose if I did kitchen cabinetry and things like that, and I'm gluing up 12 raised panel doors, I might need more clamps at that point. But for me, I don't end up needing that much. So what's happened is over time, this red section has grown as I've employed a couple shorter ones, some more 24-inch ones, and these guys have shrunk. Actually, that's not true. These have always stayed the same. My pipe clamps, I've just got a couple down in the corner. Those have disappeared. Those have been given away or sold, given away, frankly, and those have gone away. But a pipe clamp is another solution, but you definitely want to use the 3/4-inch pipe, not the 1/2-inch pipe, and you just buy the kit, the Pony, is it Pony Jorgensen that makes these guys? It's a Pony clamp. So these orange parts, you can pick these up at Home Depot or Lowe's or someplace like that, and you can buy the pipe at the same time. But this is 1/2-inch pipe. This stuff is, it's okay, but it will start to flex on you, you know, when you start gluing up panels, and you can often get panels that are warped. So it's not the best solution there. So the most economical solution is to not get carried away, frankly, and go slow. Don't be afraid to just clamp something up and let it dry before clamping the next piece. I know it freaks people out because they have to slow down and they have to stop working, but you'd be surprised the number of things you can do while something is in the clamps. Yeah, I'm just not that guy that's going to get super obsessed over the number of clamps I have in my shop. This is about the same number of clamps that I've had for 8 years. That's not true. These two guys got added 3 years ago. Everything else I've had for more than 8 years, and I really have not found a need to expand beyond it. I ran into a situation building a bed recently where I needed a super long clamp, but frankly, having a 6-foot long clamp, first of all, would be so incredibly expensive, but I would never use the thing again. So I used a windlass. I used a bit of rope, wrapped the rope around it, and twisted it up with a stick, and that was my clamp. And that was, you know, I don't even want to say an 18th century clamping method. It goes back even further than that to probably Stone Age man clamping stuff up. I did a video on that as well. I think it's called Farewell and Adieu, Ye Sweet Spanish Windlass. Don't ask. Anyway, I think I'm going to call it there. This one's easy though. Guy wants to know, what do you think the most useful router plane cutter size would be? 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch, no doubt. Sorry, not 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. 1/2 inch. This guy, here. This blade that's in my Veritas router, I think the last time, I mean, other than taking it out to sharpen it, the last time I changed that size was probably 6 years ago. I do have some small router planes that have 1/4 inch blades in them, but even they get used very rarely. This guy, that 1/2 inch blade gets used for just about everything, because what I'm using my router for is plowing out, flattening the bottoms of dados. And it's rare that I'm making a dado that's thinner than like a shelf piece, which is going to be about 3/4 inch, if not thicker. It's rare that I'm doing one that's a 1/2 inch or a 1/4 inch. If it is a 1/4 inch, it's usually in a smaller board, and it's much, much faster to just grab a chisel and knock that out than it would take time to change the blade. So 1/2 inch, and I think that's the blade that comes with like the Veritas router and the Lee Nielsen router. So yeah, just stick with that 1/2 inch. That'll do you. Oh, okay, I have to answer this question. And I'm going to go into rant mode. Chance says, I'm looking at the Lie-Nielsen shoulder planes and I've never held one in person. Which size would be the best for the most variety of uses? They have small, medium, and large. The answer, Chance, is none. I am not a shoulder plane fan. In fact, I think if you Google shoulder plane, you'll find a blog post that I wrote on them. I find them, well, for my style of working, for the more hybrid woodworker, more power tool focused woodworker, there may be some benefit to it. But the shoulder plane is designed, and I have one. Actually, I have two, but I'm actually seriously thinking about getting rid of this Veritas. Easy answer, get the large one. Because you can use it for more functions like cleaning up tenon cheeks. Actually cleaning tenon shoulders is it's something that I so rarely do anymore. When you cut enough tenons, you get to the point where you're getting them off the saw and maybe a quick undercut with a chisel and you're done. Needing to true up that shoulder with a shoulder plane becomes so unnecessary after a while that the plane just starts to gather dust. And I had a Lie-Nielsen medium plane that I ended up selling, but before I sold it, I had to clean it up because it had started to rust because it just never got used. You can use them for cleaning up tenon cheeks, but that's not even the best tool. Because they're longer than the typical tenon cheek is wide, they tend to be a little tippy and they can round over a tenon. The best thing for that, the better thing I should say for that, is a smaller like rabbiting block plane. Personally, I think the best thing for truing up tenon cheeks is a paring chisel, because you can see exactly where you're removing the wood. You've got a lot more control and flexibility, and you can really tune that in. Then I would probably go to a router plane. Then I would go to a rabbiting block plane. And then finally, when all else failed, I would actually probably go to a wooden rabbet plane after that. Then finally, I would grab a shoulder plane. And the reason for that is shoulder planes are bevel up tools. They're primarily suited for working on end grain. They're not really suited for cutting long rabbets. They are not rabbet planes. So if you cut a long rabbet, that shaving is going to curl up and clog in the mouth because it's not meant to eject it like an actual rabbet plane that has an escapement that throws the shaving off to the side. So you can plane a long rabbet and have the shaving just spit out to the side instead of curling up and clogging. Second of all, this is a bevel down aspect. It's going to do a little bit better job of cutting a long grain surface like a rabbet, because a rabbet is a long grain joint, right? The shoulder plane is going to have a tendency to want to dig in. It can tear out a little bit more without support with that bevel up aspect. So it's one of those things where it's very specifically designed for working on end grain and small shoulders. So the tenon shoulder ends up being what it's best suited for. That's why it's called the shoulder plane. And for me, in my work, I don't ever use a plane to true up my tenon shoulders. And that's not, please don't misinterpret me there. That's not like, ooh, look at me, I saw so well. It doesn't take that much practice to be sawing your tenon shoulders to the point where they don't need any work. You know, cut 6 tenons and you'll see an amazing difference in the quality of your shoulders. This is an exercise I did for apprentices in the hand tool school. It had 7 mortise and tenons in it. And the exercise going through this, a couple of people have gone through this with me. Your tenons are so much better by the time you get to just the end of something simple like this. You're definitely not using a shoulder plane to true those up. So I just find that it's a tool that doesn't get used all that much anymore in my own way of working. Where I see it getting used are the guys that do all of their joinery work with a power tool and just needed a little bit of finessing to kind of come back and clean something up. I even question how much that's necessary. Now we're getting into a personal way of working. I just personally feel that there are so many other tools that should be put ahead of the shoulder plane that I wouldn't even really look at one in the first place. But to answer your question, I would go with a large because I think that it's going to be much more beneficial. Frankly, I like Veritas shoulder planes more than I like Lie-Nielsen. Veritas shoulder planes are more comfortable to use than the Lie-Nielsen shoulder plane. They're also a little bit easier to adjust than the Lie-Nielsen. So if you are dead set on buying a shoulder plane, I would actually take a look at Veritas and compare the two of them. I think ergonomically, you'll find that the Veritas is a little edges out the Lie-Nielsen a little bit more, and I would still go with a large. But take a long, hard look at your tooling as it exists already and ask yourself, what is more important than a shoulder plane right now? If you have a very specific use for it, don't let me dissuade you. I'm just saying I ended up selling them. And I had a couple of them because I was told that's what I needed to have. Now that I think about it, that was Lie-Nielsen marketing doing a very good job. I just didn't need them. So, hey, Brian agrees with me on shoulder planes. I'm not alone on there. Yeah, the fact that it just rusted told me that it wasn't a beneficial tool to have in my shop. So, all right, guys, I got to call it a night. It's almost 8 o'clock here. I have not eaten. I'm starting to feel faint. So I appreciate everybody coming out. It's always fun to do these kind of open Q&As. So yeah. One more thing can do regarding the Perch. When I do apply finish, I'll be including that in a weekly shop update. So you're going to see more of it as I finish it up. It's just I've got other projects that need to kick in because I basically had to take almost a month off to focus on that. So yeah, you'll see it again. All right, folks. Everybody have a wonderful evening. Happy holidays and all that fun stuff. And we'll see you again soon.